for the record, Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. Yes, the less spending, the less it needs to be paid out of the education fund, the higher the yields can be. Because less money needs to be raised.
Nature of its self-equalizing features.
There's Senator Brock is with us. And it is confusing, and one of speakers today said that no solution bill today.
Okay.
Thank you. That the income sensitized would be impacted. And I've been told we have a legal opinion that we are not clear. It just says residential property tax, and it's not clear if I can't imagine we tap the wealthier people's home and let it flow through to the income sensitized, and now it's going to the business.
We need to resolve that with us.
The definitive question, yes.
So,
But the other thing is, Senator Brock is here. After getting my ears bent by my daughter, who was on a school board, they have to finalize their budget by Monday or they won't get it printed because there aren't any printers in Franklin County. So I volunteered Senator Brock to drive the budget down and get it printed where we have printers. But I mean, they're under that kind of and in the middle of their meeting the other night, they said they called Joint Fiscal and a man told them, well, I hope unless it was the janitor, I don't think it was Joint Fiscal. Well, then she said maybe it was the school boards association. Told them that the yield had dropped $600. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff. And, these are gaining schools, but they're trying to stay under the 10%. And a lot of it is needed, deferred maintenance that when they're getting some extra dollars, you're waiting, they're trying to make up on that, delayed maintenance. And that's something that we know if we don't deal with as a state, like we did with school construction, it is going to show up on the tax rate. And several of the speakers today mentioned needing to do basic health and safety kinds of keeping up with 30, 40-year-old school. So, and if we're gonna do anything, I think it's probably gonna have to go in budget adjustment that make any difference this year. Which gives us about 2 weeks, maybe. They're doing budget adjustment on the floor now. And usually we just fine tune most of it.
is there any way to clarify that what 5% means? Or
Well, I read the law and I thought, and I checked with Ruth Hardy, who was the director, when that bill came through here, our understanding was that your budget going up or down, the impact of the weighting couldn't impact your budget more than 5%. But I brought up the act and it doesn't. It says your budget can't go up more than 5% of your 2024 budget.
not
Is that correct?
as a result of this law, or it just can't go up more than 5%
Well,
no matter
that's-
what?
So to clarify, the transition mechanism in Act 127 says a school district's equalized tax rate, homestead tax rate, cannot increase by more than 5% compared to the prior year. The 10% refers to the school district's per pupil spending, in which that's a trigger mechanism where if a school district's per pupil spending, when calculated under the same funding formula, so it's an apples to apples comparison, their per pupil spending increases by more than 10%, that school district is subject to go before a tax rate review board. And the tax rate review board looks at if that school district should receive the 5% cap. Or if the school district has the language, I believe uses the term excessive. And should not qualify.
What were we afraid of when we put that in? That the receiving schools, the schools that are gonna get more tax capacity would suddenly. And I thought it was, you couldn't drop your budget more than 5%, even if that was not there. But then, so that's how we're dealing with the schools that are gaining 300 student tax capacity. We're saying if you go up more than 10% for student spending in a year, you have to go. I don't think that's at all understood. It seems to be they've got to keep their budget under 10% with the 5% cap. So their tax rate can't go up, but their budget.
Yeah, so school districts, with respect to this transition mechanism. The transition mechanism is not saying to school districts, your budget can only increase by X%. Essentially, it's saying, if your per pupil spending increases by more than 10%. You need to go before this review board to see if you qualify for the 5% tax rate cap.
So if your budget only goes up 8%, you've still got the 5% cap on your residential. And it isn't clear if it's all residential, but that float in the middle is going to be put on to whoever is not residential.
Exactly, and or put on to other homestead taxes that are not capped. So I believe that one of the witnesses in the previous testimony was talking about.
That's an in-town thing.
Which is an.
When you're shifting from this group to that group, the answer doesn't get the cap. That's within the municipality.
If I'm talking about across the whole state, so you're gonna see school districts that are not being capped and other school districts that are being capped. So those that are being capped, there's an amount that's not being raised on that school district's grant list.
Which is,
That needs to be made up by others.
thank you, that
Yes. And
says who, we did.
so
Yeah.
who is it?
So there's the homestead property tax cap applies to homestead districts.
Right.
Any district that would have a year-over-year equalized rate increase, so that's the equalized rates before the CLA is applied, of more than 5%. So non-homestead, there's no cap on non-homestead rates. And I believe that it is outstanding in terms of the legal interpretation as to whether or not income rates would be capped. However, I will also add on that. Regardless of if income rates for the income sensitized property taxpayers, regardless if those income rates are capped or not, the yield can be set in such a way so that the income sensitized folks, the folks who are paying on income, have the same average bill change. So we can mathematically back into the yield, the income yield to ensure they're moving together.
Which when Senator McDonald, I always see a bicycle in gears, which maybe how he described it. But we do have a balance switch in there. Okay, but so residential. But is there a school district that isn't under the cap that didn't get affected up or down by waiting? I doubt it.
So it will ultimately depend on what as we start to get warned budgets, it will depend on what the costs are in the education fund that need to be paid. So in the December 1st letter, we had the estimated education spending. The majority of school districts were capped in that modeling. And that was super preliminary data that is now stale. So as we get the data of warned budgets starting to come in, we'll have a better sense of who is or is not capped.
But we were paying waiting before. this big change, I mean, there's a change between schools if you've lost students or gained students. But we also significantly upgraded what you got for a weight. And we added a new weight in the ruralness. And so essentially, this is because the state said we want to invest more in kids that need more help. But we didn't put any of our money into that.
Right, so the change in weights is not changing the amount of funding that a school district
Yes.
receives. The change in weights is changing the calculation of that district's tax rate dependent on the amount of funding that they receive from the education fund based on their budget.
And you get payment per student, right? So if you're weighted, you've got two kids that come from very poor families and they're weighted at 1.5, you will pick up an extra student from those two, because they each get a half. You're getting paid for more students than you actually have in the end. Or you get more, the more weighted kids you have, the more money the school district gets.
The more weighted pupils that a school district has, the more money the school district can receive from the education fund for the same property tax rate.
Right. And but because we increased those weights and added weights, they are entitled to more money than they were last year from the ed fund, but we have not put in any additional revenue into the ed fund.
So it's just the same principle, or same problem we had when, as the school population drops, in which case, schools have fewer kids, which means, by definition, their cost per pupil is gonna go up. And we said, my goodness, the cost per pupil is gonna go up, they're gonna have to raise more money, so we'll put in a cap on how many kids who leave the school district we actually count. We'll cut that number and give them more money than they have students to justify the money that we're gonna give them, so that they don't
I don't
crash.
remember.
Pardon?
I don't remember that one. I remember the 3-year,
Fancy student argument.
oh, that was small. Yeah, because we never took that one out. Every year they got another one. In the end, they had a dozen students. Yeah. Yeah,
But when we have a formula that when it is burdensome, we tend to want to monkey with it. So it's not to hold everybody to the formula that we say is fair.
The tax review board, is that a new concept?
So the rate review board stemmed from, I believe it was Act 46, which was the merger bill. There was similar language. Basically, not the same, a similar construct, and so AOE recommended at the time of Act 127, the testimony AOE recommended that would be included. And my understanding is that when it was originally included in Act 46, that it wasn't used.
That's been,
At the
I've never
time.
heard of anybody voting. Then again,
I will also add that the transition mechanism in Act 46, while this review board was either similar or the same, the transition mechanism was different. That had since taken off of the rate. This is a percentage cap.
we did a lot to encourage schools to merge. And there was a lot of transition money in there. But this one, we don't have any money. And Maybe you can.
No, I'm just, I was, I'm great, talking with Ernst Young, and we pulled up budgets, and I think it was a $250 million growth increase. So, I don't know how that's distributed. I don't know if you've looked and seen, you know, we heard some people reporting out, oh, we have very lean budgets. Have you seen what the range of growth is and just looked at that? I don't know if you have any sense of ballpark. Yeah, as low as 4%, as high as 32%.
Yeah, I will be interested to see that. I still have not received any updated budget data for any school district. I believe that AOE is in the process of collecting it. And so I get that data from AOE. So once they have collected that data, they then share it with me. So I haven't seen it yet.
Spending is up across the board.
Based on the December 1 projections, yes, so the December 1 letter, AOE estimated a 12%, maybe this gets at your question, Senator.
Yeah.
Estimated a 12% increase in education spending. Well, remember that education spending is not spending on education, but that is school district budget less offsetting revenues, and the remainder is the education spending. So yes, we're seeing an increase of about 200 million, estimated increase in the education payment, which is the aggregated ed spending, the state from FY 24 to FY 25. How close that is to what will actually come about with budgets, I don't know. We've also seen additional pressures, in the education fund from, other appropriations that have been made out of the education fund over time.
Yeah.
So,
Well, someone who said, oh, you were in legislative or Dave Butler, and someone's in the grocery store and I said, I hear all these budgets are going up so much. Can you explain, what would you say to someone about why this year seems to be so much more expensive than last year?
so,
You know, like the grocery store conversation version.
so if I were to talk to someone in the grocery store,
Yeah.
so I would,
This happens, you know, you go to the grocery store, and people peg you and they say, what's going on over there? How is it possible that it's so much more expensive?
Why are
this
you
year
gonna
than last
raise
year?"
my taxes 18%?
18%, right.
Could I jump in and
Maybe.
no, because you're all sort of asking me my question as well, but I wanna break it into some of its parts.
Well, can we do the like
Okay.
simple version first before we go the
Okay,
text?
so I would say the simple version to that
Yeah,
is that our education fund is self-balancing. So we have to raise enough revenue to make sure we can pay out everything that's fitting into the ed fund. And what we're seeing this year is that the non-property tax revenue sources that are coming in as revenues into the ed fund are growing at a much slower pace than what we need to pay out of the ed fund. So if you're seeing 9% growth in total education fund expenditures, and you're only seeing 2%, 3% growth in non-property revenues, the remainder needs to be made up somewhere. And the only flexible lever that the General Assembly has traditionally used is property taxes.
thank you.
And because we've had those, we've never had a normal year in the
There's other
sales tax, what?
There's other levers. like-
No, the law had written into it that the appropriations for school funding every year will be a number calculated by a bunch of stuff, cost of living, et cetera, et cetera. And for a bunch of years, and for many years, that was implemented. And the appropriations committee was. Now I'm being a picture of it. They were, damn it, every year they come and take our budget for schools. And we don't like it. So they convinced the legislature to eliminate the part of the law that said the general fund was obliged to pay a certain percent increase every year to account for cost of living expenses and a formula that was in place. And instead, we're going to designate them this block of money and they're gonna live by it. And what was put in place was the sales tax revenue, the lottery, and whatever today is in place. So the amount of money that the appropriations committee sends to the legislature. The Appropriations committee goes, well, the law says this is what we sent. And we might say, well, this year there's a whole bunch of different expenses and the law currently says, so what? This is what you get. This is the sales tax, this is the lottery, this is the purchase and use, this is what you get. And this is not a good year for schools on what you get, because that money is not tied to sort of the economy and what's going on in the great picture. It's tied to the black and white of the law. And that's where we are.
Okay.
Am I incorrect? Or am I?
I might disagree with some of your motivation statements.
Fair enough. But
You're correct as to what happened, the motivation, I think it came out when we were.
all well-intended motivation, Madam
Yes, we were
Chair.
in a basic recession, we were hatcheting everything. And we had to pay out full to the schools who kept raising their budgets every year. And so we were hatcheting mental health and every other service in the state, and the schools kept, we had to pay them plus. And so we actually have made out much better than we would have, because when we got the sales tax, it was producing about as much revenue as we were getting.
But it's rigid.
It's rigid. And then we got the Wayfair decision, and we have in fact, I think, because we've spent all that extra money we got for 3 or 4 years, and tax rates have artificially held them down. And so now we don't have that, but I suppose, there's a presumption in some places in this building that schools just like to spend money. And that anything the schools want, they should get. And there's another one that says they need
Now
to be.
you're guilty of what you were saying.
know.
I didn't say
I
guilty
said there
for-
is some places here, there are other places that feel that the schools should have to react to the general economy and the kind of downturns that everybody else has to. And we still try and find that balance.
Madam Chair. This is what I need, and if the rest of the committee need this, then I will try to make arrangements on my own. I have two questions, two things I simply do not understand. One is, where does an 18% increase come from? I understand that we have an 18%. What is there in our structures that leads to that? And the other one is, why are resident taxes in some towns higher than non-residential? We've got at least 3 members of this committee who go back to Act 60. The whole idea was that that would be the exact opposite. What I picture is this. Here's the equation. The equation involves weighting, and I understand weighting. It involves Act 127. I understand that. It involves the CLA. I understand that. It involves equity. I understand that. What I don't understand is how those factors act on one another in the equation. I do get it that none of these operate alone. They operate alone and none of them just operate alone. They operate alone and they operate on one another. And that those integrated operations have resulted in an 18% increase and have resulted in residential taxes being higher than the non-residential. But I don't get how that works. And then the other thing is if there's an 18%
There
increase,
is no 18% increase.
well, we're told by our
He has the.
by the administration that there is. Well, we're told by the administration that there is. If there isn't, then that's important news too. If I may finish,
Yes.
the one last thing is, if there's an increase happening somewhere in these back and forth and this acting on that, who is getting a decrease?
Nobody.
No, and then how, okay, I guess I'm saying, how does that happen? Where does that come? So I think that's my, and I don't know if we're gonna get a quick facile answer this
No, I think
afternoon.
Julia
but
could give you the finances. Nobody got a decrease basically because the cost has gone up. And it's just who is paying that cost is the balance between residential or homestead and non-homestead. That's basically what we had. And then I was here, I wasn't here for Act 60, I was down the hall. But I do remember one of my first years here, that we set the rate for the homestead and the non-homestead. And we set the non-homestead higher and than the homestead. But at that time, I remember saying that we knew that those two lines were going to cross. And they have in many towns. And basically, we haven't fixed it because it would have a disruption in people's property taxes, and we just haven't had the intestinal fortitude to do it on our own, and nobody's yelled at us about it.
I mean, going back to the ancient Greeks, the tax, I'm sorry if you find that annoying, Mark. Going back to the ancient Greeks, we taxed luxuries one way, we taxed necessities another way. And your home is a necessity, your second home, my family had one, I loved it, but it was obviously by definition a luxury.
Yeah, that's one of the notes I have for today's conversation. Mark, did you have something to say?
The December 1st letter was put in place to solve a problem that was taking place. But the letter is supposed to say, if the school districts pass budgets and the towns approve the budgets that we think they're likely to recommend and pass, what will the tax rate be under current law? And the Commissioner of Taxes is obliged to take a look at current law, consult with the Secretary of Education, Property Evaluation and Review, and a couple other, consult with others, the Secretary of Administration, and give the best estimate based on what the administration and this group believe is gonna happen in the last week of November. They write the letter. And the letter said, gee, if everything goes on as we think it might go on, based on the indications we have under current law, that and the budgets were to pass, it would be an 18% increase.
But
Which is-
till we
yeah.
know what the budgets
Until
are.
My reference to an 18% tax increase was a shorthand for that.
Yeah, it's.
Well, it's, when we get into shorthand, people, you get into problems, and if I may, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The reason that there is a December 1st letter was because the law fixed the tax rate when Act 60 passed. It was gonna be $1.10, period. Year after year after year after year after year. It would be $1.10. And lo and behold, in the first couple of years, the values right up. And $1.10 raised a whole lot of money. More than what was necessary to fund the schools as what was necessary for what it looked like in late November, on December 1st, then whatever be necessary to fund the schools. So, but we didn't have a December 1st letter, and the administration at the time, Governor Dean, put out a budget which recognized all this extra money that was being raised by the common level of appraisal, going up and getting more tax. And it went into the budget and said, we don't need it, the state doesn't need to pay its share, legal share of the school budget, of the school budgets. It doesn't, the appropriations committee doesn't have to send to the school districts what Act 60 calls for. We've got this extra money because property values are up. And the administration, the governor recommended that they put the money, that they take the money out of the appropriations fund and use it for other spending. And this happened 1 year, and then next year, Governor Douglas was governor, and he did the same damn thing. Appraisals are up, we got more money than we need, so the commitment that Act 60 had, that the appropriations committee had to spend. They weren't gonna send the schools all the money, because they didn't need it, they could get it from the property tax. That's what happened, and we said, you were the chair at the time.
No, I do not remember.
Is it still Rivers?
I think it might have been Rivers,
But
but I was here during Douglas.
and we said. The governor's already spent the money in his budget, these two governors, before we even get here. And when we try to correct what's going on, we're the ones that are raising taxes. We're the ones that are raising taxes. So the governors from then on had to say what the law would, the existing law would collect in the way of revenues. An estimate on the 1st of December, so that the government, whoever was governor, couldn't spend it in the budget address before it even came to us. That's why the number is there, and different tax commissioners. The first year, it was a 3-sentence letter. We're supposed to do the recommend blah, 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 we say this is what's gonna happen. If you have any questions, give us a call, that was the letter, basically. By the time, who's the tax commissioner that wrote the 3-pager listing all the ways to cut spending.
Is that
and
Powell?
Yeah, Powell, and
You know.
got into editorial comments in the December 1st letter and provided a heck of a lot more than was ever contemplated in the letter. And this year, this year's letter was a jolt, and I think the chair is correct. There is a bit of a storm here that has riled things.
I remember the
Thank you.
December 1st letter as being, because we tried everything to make schools people not vote their budgets. And we put our yield, we put all kinds of messages, what your yield and what your rate, your pupil rate is compared to the state average. And so this was to tell them and to tell people, if you vote the budget that you're projected to vote, this is what your tax rate's gonna be, so that they knew going in what was likely to happen. I don't think we have ever managed to curb or change people's behavior when it comes to their school budgets. But I've never known school budgets to go up 18%, so we are here, Senator Chin, did you have?
We've always had a dollar figure or a yield that was less than predicted on the 1st of December, not by much, but we've always had one that was a little bit less than it.
So I've got a few things to say. One, I do agree with Senator McCormick that we need to define the problem. And so I really appreciate the way you framed that question. I define the problem as a few macroeconomic aspects. One, the evaporation of one-time ESSER funding, as well as what Julia just said, which is the growth of non-property tax revenues haven't kept up with the increased costs of education in Vermont. And then very importantly, spending is up across the board. And it's up across the board because of the macroeconomic things of inflation, as well as contracts that were negotiated in light of that inflation. But we have to take some fault here. Our formula that we put into place 2 years ago disincentivizes frugality. It has a perverse incentive for districts to spend up to maximize their return. So if that's the problem that I think that we're facing, this is where I sort of am forward looking. And so what do we do in this mess? And I'm just saying, this is me wrestling with a really complex problem and looking for additional perspectives. Scott Beck has some great ideas. He caught me in the hall. But I personally, I don't feel we can change the rules for this year. I just, my current inclination is not to take away this 5% this year. But I will say that because it's too late in the game. It is January 25th. They are printing budgets right now. School boards have approved these things. We need to let the voters have their say on March 5th. And I expect a great deal of budgets to go down, which I want to better understand if half of the budgets go down and there's cuts, how that might affect some of the estimates that school districts have. I just have a couple more things to say, Chair. So I really, what I do support doing, and I think we should focus our energies on, is we can't have this 5% thing next year and the year after. So as much as it was passed 2 years ago, this 5% threshold cap for the next 5 years is just unsustainable. It's just, I don't see it as possible. We have to correct it for next year. And that's where I really like us to revisit a 5-year rolling average of pupil weights so that districts can see very clearly how it is this year, how it averages with the previous 4 years, and what it's likely to occur the next year. And so they will see the train coming and they will have a much better glide path without a perverse incentive.
I think that's what we thought we were doing, at least in this committee.
So I agree. So that's what I understood. The Senate passed out 2 years ago, then it got changed at the last minute in the House. Regardless, I fully support changing the 5% cutoff next year, but I just know school boards enough to say I'm very hesitant to change the rules of the game now on January 25th. The last thing I'll say is I personally think that if we commit to correcting this 5% thing for next year, we as a legislature should. I personally want to find about $100 million to fund to buy down the the taxes in the ed fund and this has to be new revenue sources since it's self-equating. So I would like to look at new revenue sources, which means more taxes, but not from property taxes or not necessarily taxes, but the 3 areas that come to my mind. My friend in the room is not going to want to hear this, but I do believe we should look at a 2-cent per ounce excise tax, which was considered in the child care bill published last year, which could raise approximately $30 million. And that's
Excise tax on what?
sugary sweetened beverages.
We have that on board.
So that's $30 million to fund compensate for universal meals, which this legislature also put into the ed fund. That's 30 million of the 100 million you want to get to. I personally want to better understand from smart people like Julia why we have a stabilization fund, if not to stabilize in circumstances like this.
We
And so
we could use that, we just would have to replace it next year.
And so that's why I say I support a change for next year with an adjustment for this year. And then it's come up multiple times and I just don't know where this is, but I fully support looking at non-homestead vacation homes, those tax rates, which was offered in testimony multiple times today. I would love to do that this year, but I understand that we don't currently capture that granularity
Well,
on our tax.
they're supposed to, and. Yeah.
So all of that.
The person wasn't here, so we got, a regular tax guy. But we will have her back because they were studying and they should be able to granulate out. It would be non-homestead properties. And it's when they granulate between business and non-homestead residential. And I'm planning to ask them what that might raise if we raised the property tax for 1%, or we may have to do it as a surcharge. As long as you don't get deer camps.
Last thing, so I would love for Julia to understand if $100 million in additional revenues from those types of things would in fact, how it could affect the 18% across the board. In my calculus, that could buy down to like 5% across the board, but you understand this better than I do and better than anybody else in the state, so I have more explanation.
I think our best hope is probably the second home tax. Non-residential, non-homestead residential. Because right now they're paying the full brunt of this. If this goes through with a 5% on residential, I think we'll probably make it clear that he also meant paying on income residential. And that we could do in the budget adjustment. But if we take them out, then, and put that under the cap, then everything, if they're capped at 5 and they're spending 12, that the rest of that is going on to your local business and your apartments, including low income. Senator Ron Hinsdale.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was going to bring up is I think that Commissioner Bolio actually showed his hand on this one with their proposal on a property tax rate freeze for blighted low value properties that they want to, incentivize to be rebuilt. When we asked in our committee if that would only apply to, homesteads and places occupied by year-round residents, Commissioner Bolio said he could ensure that that was the case or take back the tax incentive because they would either have to file a homestead declaration or a landlord certificate. And we have many other housing policies where we're trying to get them, we're trying to incentivize people to submit those forms, especially the landlord certificate. And then, they could create another form requesting a waiver for a deer camp or, demonstrating in some way that, this is not a year-round property of some kind. But I really, when they wanted to do it for a tax break, Commissioner Bolio seemed to be very rosy about the possibility of doing this. And I really think it would incentivize people to fill out those forms and advocate if they're not simply a non-primary residence. But I think it has a lot of merit, and I think it's the path forward.
I think that's the one bill I'm pretty sure we could get through this entire body. I have told the commissioner, I'll talk to him about freezing property tax rates once we straighten out this 18% difference. The administration has been totally hands-off. We didn't even read the Ed Fund outlook at the emergency board today, which I think means they don't have a solution. They might, we might get a second home tax through. But we couldn't start that until July, right? June, the fiscal year. So we won't have any money really in from that to buy it down next year.
With respect to implementing a new revenue stream, I think it depends on the revenue stream as to how quickly that could be stood up. And so I believe that there are some taxes or revenue streams that could come into play at the start of FY 25. But I would defer to my colleague Ted Barnett at JFO. He's really the point person on consumption taxes. Yeah.
Second home tax, if not this year, then next year, if not next year, the year
But
after.
it won't help this year, but we
No,
can
but,
raise.
but the other thing is, Senator Ron Hinsdale's committee has to do with the housing issue, is the short-term rentals.
I think
Taxing
you're
them.
going to pick those up in the second home. If you're not living in the home and you're short-term renting it, then you're gonna get picked up. I think and if you're not living there as your primary residence, I think, and you'll get picked up. What that will avoid is the little old lady who rents out her attic for foliage season to pay her taxes, which is where we always get into trouble. But if you do it non-residential, then you're gonna pick up the folks that don't live in the house and rent it out.
But also we have a lot of things we do that have to do with the number of units.
Not in taxing.
Maybe not, well, is there some reason why we can't? But in a way, using the number of units as a way of identifying what kind of business it is. I think the short-term rentals are a specific kind of business that are different from long-term rentals and different from
No, a
the
lot of
family.
them are just, you can rent my mini house and you can rent my house, I go, where do you think all our legislators stay? So if you're a short-term rental, I think, no, you're over 3 months, so probably not. But those people are gone to Florida and they rent out to legislators. Otherwise, they might be short-term rental it and rent it out.
But there are also people or companies that own like 5 or
Oh,
6
well,
houses.
those,
They do
then
nothing.
we'll pick them up. They'll be
Second
praised.
homes.
Yeah. If they've got, I mean, most of them are outside of Chittenden County, are large units. We have some big homes around ski areas. And, but you're also appraised as big homes around ski areas and you'll up their tax rate. You don't wanna meddle. Every time we try and fine tune things, we get in trouble. Randy.
You're muted.
I know. I've listened to this discussion as well as this is one of many over a long period of time. There are a few things that come to my mind out of this. We have very long discussions about what our tax law means and whether it's 5% here or there and what it applies to and so on. Yeah, this is too damn complicated. And I'm not sure that everybody around this table really understands what we're doing and why and how. And that concerns me a lot. And one of the larger problems that I see is we need a tax code that not only can the average Vermonter understand, but that we can understand. Because I'm not sure that all of us really understand this based on these discussions that I've heard. So that's kind of item one. The second, we have now, at least at last count, what I've heard is the second highest education tax rate per pupil of any state in the country. And we're making it worse. We're making it higher. I'm sure we're vying for number one. And I'm not sure that I really understand why. I mean, I've heard various reasons that, well, we throw a lot of stuff at education that really isn't education. It really ought to be healthcare or something else. But others do. And I know we've done some studies along these lines in the past, but I've never been satisfied with the results and the answers. We treat this as a revenue problem, and we're now looking to desperately increase revenue to solve this problem. When I wonder if we should have an equal, if not a greater focus on looking at the cost elements associated with this, because I'm really concerned about the end. If we're approaching it the way we're approaching it here, it will never, ever end.
So Senator Brock, I agree with you. What I see as one of the fundamental problems is that we, the legislature, don't control the spending, the local voters do because of local control. So if my statement that I just made there was two-pronged. One, I think we need to let these budgets go before the voters, and I think they're gonna vote it down, which will put that cutting pressure that currently exists to reduce spending. And I feel like because we have some faults, our hands are not clean with the formula having some flaws that we're now really revealing. That's where I support finding some additional revenues for this year while we fix this 5% perverse incentive for next year. And so that's why I was taking a two-pronged approach, but I completely agree with you. We need to look at the spending, but that's done by the school boards at the local level with the voters voting on those budgets or not.
I mean, what the biggest.
We need to deal with the spending, but we also need to deal with the methodology, because it's the methodology and the complexity associated with the methodology, the way the methodology is applied, and how we do what we do, that also is a great deal of the problem here.
Agreed.
What we've got is a combination of trying to maintain local control and meet the Brigham decision of equalizing the revenue. Other states, just for whatever sources, get the money and say, this is how much we have for education this year. We divided up schools, that's what you get, make do. And it's, but that's really the other alternative where we decide what gets spent. And the state, most New England states seem to spend more on education than anywhere else, so.
Voters get to decide on March 5th.
They do, and I think we will need some money, but we increased spending. We did the weighting, we increased the money that went to the schools for weights. And we added a whole separate section that wasn't there before by whether or not you were rural, which I have some questions about. But all of that, we're paying for a lot more students than we have actual students, and that's a good thing. But we have our blame in that we added this cost for a good reason.
We added costs like
Yeah.
universal meals, but the weighting is really the shifting financial burden,
Yeah.
not spending. We didn't do spending, we adjusted the weighting, we just reallocated who pays what based on competition of kids.
And
But
when we did the weighting with the task force, the goal of it, at least in the start, and it evolved, I think, and more, was that we're not increasing spending, we're redistributing spending
Right.
to ensure that what we spend is fair.
And burden, hey.
That was the goal of the weighting task force.
what we spent on waiting last year as opposed to what we will be spending on waiting, or even this year, how much more are we?
So we can't really get those numbers because weighting is solely shifting the taxing capacity. It's not shifting costs.
But if we increase everyone's taxing capacity, then that's going to increase, I mean, the hope is they're getting extra money to give the extra services to the kids. So if they're getting extra money and we don't have an equal number of people who are losing money or taxing capacity, then we're causing more money to be taken out of the system.
Chair, if I may.
Yeah.
There's just a very important distinction here. I think we welcome Julia correcting me or whatnot. There's what we spend on education and how we pay for it. Those are two separate sides of the ledger. And so the pupil funding really for me was just changing how we pay for it. The spending, we spend the money on is what's approved at the local level by the budgets. Is that correct?
Yes, and the spending is at the local level, and then as the committee has mentioned, there's also the state initiatives like universal school meals and other categorical aid programs.
But if we've created more spending, which is what we hope to do, we hope to have more money go in to help more students. If we've created more spending, that it's being reflected in the tax rates this year, that's the difference.
If I may, I think that I'm hearing two simultaneously correct points.
Okay,
And so, if I may clarify,
please.
the conversation, the discourse around Act 127 and pupil weights, as Madam Chair, as you're expressing, was saying, you know, certain kids are in certain classes are likely more costly or less costly to educate. So because of that, we need to count them as more than one kid because they likely have additional costs associated with them. So yes, that is how the intuition of the pupil weights follows. With respect to the funding side of things, the pupil weights are addressing the fitting into the calculation of the tax rate. So then getting to the other point that's being made is with respect to local decision being made with respect to funding regardless. One may say regardless of pupil weights, one may also say depending on what our tax rate is going to be for that spending, we're going to spend more or less dependent on our pupil weights. So I think it's sort of a yes and, right? Pupil weights are adjusting tax rates. And they may also fit into the calculus of how school districts are spending, but.
Yes, but look, as we go back to the weighting and what the weighting task force was looking at, and the classic examples was when the task force looked at schools across the state, they looked at the school in the Northeast Kingdom that barely had one sport, and they looked at the school in one of our more populous counties that had 6 sports. And they sort of said that is inequitable, and therefore the amount of money that goes to the 6-sport school to support those sports ought to be somewhere equalized with that little school that only had 1 sport. What it didn't say is we're going to figure out how to shovel the 6-sport school into a formula that allows them to keep the 6 sports and then figure out how to give 5 more sports to the school in the little town in the Northeast Kingdom. That wasn't what the waiting task force was supposed to do, and that should not have been the end result of what we've done. It should be, in fact, if it was focused on equalization, it ought to have dealt with equalization. And if the formula is doing something other than that, then we messed up badly.
But we put 5%.
That was a 5% cap, but that cap was solely, in terms of the cap, was to ensure that when equalization occurred, that there wouldn't be a disproportionate and kind of an undue impact in a real short-term period on any school district whose rates were changed because of equalization. But it wasn't to create a windfall somewhere.
Yeah, and that's what they're seeing it as, is a windfall.
That was not the intent, and any of the documents associated with this project never reflected that as an intent.
No.
But to change it now is very problematic, right, for this budgetary cycle.
It would be very difficult, yes. We could move all the dates up and tell them they have until February to put things together. Barry's already moved their day to May. Montpelier had theirs in May for a while and nobody came, so we were back to town meeting day, but several towns do it later. But
I'm very, very hesitant to do something now that modifies tax rates to, in effect, add a new tax or to add an increase in existing taxes, and the notion that we're doing something short term, because these things rarely go away. And I'm just concerned with the precedent. I'm concerned with the economic impact in the short run, and I'm also concerned with the message.
no, I think we're looking at a new base that ESSER money has allowed them to hire people to deal with issues that our mental health system can't deal with because they don't have the resources to pay at a school rate or to hire and keep personnel. And that's because we've underfunded them for many years. I don't think those issues are gonna go away. I don't think all of them are COVID costs. We've got mental health issues with adolescents across the board, including great increases in suicides. And I don't think that money's going away. I think we may be looking at a new base. The question will be, what do we do when half those budgets go down?
But do we say that the 49 other states are all going down the drain and we're the only one who's doing it right because we're spending an enormous amount of money that continually increases and never seems to stop increasing? If we're doing so much better, are we doing so much better than all the other states that are spending less per pupil than we are?
Probably not.
Good. Sorry.
Okay, that's Senator McRae. Do you have one?
Well, so I'm pretty certain everyone's supportive of and sensitive about the mental health of students. What is hard for me to, what I don't have a very clear picture of is where the 250 extra million, 12%, whatever, what does it mean spent? And stop right there. Where is that money going? And to Senator Brock's point, we always seem like it's like when you talk about bringing wages into alignment, no one who is above the average is pulled down to the lower wage. People only move up. So that sort of rationing, I'm feeling like as you said, then we end up with a new base that just grew by 12%. What happens next year?
Yeah, inflation seems to be ratcheting down. I mean, one of the problems is we have a very small tax base. And those of us that are here are aging. There's no place to go down. We need more kids in the schools.
Right, and there's the declining population,
Yes.
there's increasing costs.
Which means we need housing, but that's part of the problem. But you heard one of the schools say today, there's a behavior interventionist. That's when the kid starts throwing things or becoming totally disruptive. schools have behavior interventionists on payroll 24/7, because the thing that shocked me when I went to education was the level of violence that was in the schools. Absolute violence towards other students, but I wanted to go home, get all my grandkids and hug them. That to me was shocking. And that's new. That wasn't there when my kids went through school. And that wasn't that long ago. And so the schools, the mental health services can't equal the wages. The mental health services we've underfunded, so the schools are hiring their own behavioral interventionists. And my local mental health agency runs an alternative school where kids can go for a while till they learn not to throw chairs in school, and teachers. But one day when I was over there, one of the teachers was being taken to the emergency room because of damage the child did to him. So schools are dealing with a lot of this, and that's, yeah.
Yeah, well, just so as I was saying, I think everyone's here is sensitive to and wants to support mental health of faculty, staff, students. I would just like to know it would be helpful to know the 250, how much that is going to behavior intervention, knowing the rest of that.
Well, that's, I think, part of the data that we haven't been getting, that we used to get from the Department of Education, is to how those budgets break down. What do they look like now? I guess we'll have some of it next week. But Senator Kitchell was saying she watched something about, training teachers to deal with kids in the classroom better, to deal with, before things get out of hand. Well, that's something the Department of Education should be doing. You can do one training and that might keep us from having to have 3 alternative.
Well, and I think one last thing is, for years I've wondered about if we segregated social services delivered in the venue known as a school out and called it a general fund obligation versus education proper, it would help us see how much of this is educational stuff versus, that the schools are a place where we deliver mental health, physical health, public health. Whole families come in, can meet with counselors at school.
Oh, yeah, I mean, the schools are dealing with all social ills that we have.
So it may not be, I'm just saying, it may not really be quite fair to call it an education expense.
No, that's where we're paying for it.
Right.
And we forced the issue because we don't have alternatives out there.
Right.
Okay, Randy's got his hand up, and then Senator Chitton, and
I was-
one thing, you were in that.
Madam Chair, just so you know, I do have to leave in 4 minutes, so when I pack my computer up.
Okay,
Just because I don't know.
I think we're in the discussion phase.
Okay.
Then, we're ready to ask for numbers.
Okay.
I got Randy, then I'll get Senator McDonald.
Is there a JFO primer so that if some citizen says, I'd like to know more about what's going on, that we can refer them to something?
I could certainly send you a few documents,
Okay.
and then if you are looking for something else, we can.
Great.
I can draw my hand raised.
Senator McDonald, would you feel better?
How does that?
I'll let you go before.
I'll print by tomorrow.
Yeah.
He was next in line, I missed him, I apologize.
Review.
Julia,
all.
Mark has a.
Please don't go away. You explained to us about the 127, that we were gonna send more resources to school districts that had kids that were more expensive to educate. I think that was basically you were restating the rationale of what took place. Implicit in that explanation is that students from other families are less expensive to educate. And when we accepted the law it was with the understanding that since the other schools were less expensive, and students were less expensive to educate, that they wouldn't get as much money. And the schools that had kids that were more costly would get more money. And we added a provision that this is gonna be difficult to make this transition, and it'll take place over 5 years, which right now looks pretty ambitious. But we didn't fund it. And we said we'll do it slowly, so that there can be the adjustments to do this. And whenever we've changed formulas for school funding, whether it was Homestead or Miller or things in the past, 60 and Act 68, we've always tried to keep folks harmless. When others have gotten more money, you don't. Yeah, and this is new territory, and we've entered it at what turns out to be an unfortunate time, because there are other expenses that all school districts are being squeezed with right now. But when you take from one group to fund another, you've got feedback. And that's what we've done, and it's a bit of a shock.
Okay. Senator Brock, can Julia go? Randy?
Yes,
Okay.
Thank you, Julie.
absolutely. Thank you.
You should, I'm sure.
I'm sure. Okay. Randy, the floor is yours.
I think I've said,
That was an
I
old-
think I've said enough for now. And I'll pass it on to someone else.
Okay, Senator Chittenden, I think I had you.
I just want to pick up on something Senator Bray said, and I completely agree. And this was my biggest concern with the pupil weights. I feel like we're focusing way too much on how to pay for the spending, and we have not successfully found clear metrics and transparency as to where we're spending money in our schools. I understand from just before my time, there was a general ledger effort to get all the schools, but that blew up.
Could we all have the same ledger and could it, and then it turned out people label things differently.
I think we should revisit that. If we really want to systematically address this and give some greater clarity as to where we're spending money across schools, so voters can be more informed, we need every school to report things the same way, so we can compare those, also
Do you know how many years it's been trying to get the schools on the same?
Thousand-mile walk starts with one step.
Oh, it's been started. I think that was Tim Ash's.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't Tim Ash. It was me when I was a state auditor in
Okay,
2004. One of
This
the
is
first
great.
things I noticed was that everybody in the school system seemed to have the same general ledger in terms of the account numbers, but they all put different things in every account. And I remember starting at that time saying, we got to get this straightened out because it makes no sense. That was in 2004.
and it hasn't. Jim, I remember saying, the United States won World War II, the Korean War. I think he may have thrown World War I in there in less time than it's taken us to get all the schools on the same.
1,336 days until Jared.
I mean, it was, it's been, and just try and get the school calendars to all align, you know? There are sacred things that you can't touch, but I'll let those go, those small problems, but the accounting ledgers aren't. And that's all, we can't find out what the average school spends on X, because X is in different fields in different ledgers, so can't say, well, what do schools spend on, books or food and we can't get an average.
Right. So my tour of duty was maybe like from 4 years ago to 8 years ago, and I remember just not really getting very far. And then business managers were very unhappy with the idea that they were gonna have to change software and because they had so much invested in that accounting system.
Oh, yeah.
And they weren't all using the same stuff, so there was kind of like the interchangeable metaphors that are not interchangeable thing going on.
Utilities that have to
We need
reprogram their
Rosetta Stone.
computers.
What I'll also say is information systems have gotten nothing but better. And so
Okay.
just because this was a big problem 8 years ago, doesn't mean we should reconsider
But
today.
it is,
And you can't improve what you don't measure. And if we're not measuring things the same way, we can't improve it. So,
you're in a long line.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
You're in a good
again,
spot.
they'll tell you it's an expense and it'll go on. I think we also, in fairness, the schools have to do something about, not school construction, but rehabbing 40-year-old schools. That turned up in separate budgets today, and right now, if they're gonna upgrade, it goes in the budget, and so everybody pays for it. And we haven't, the shock one was how we paid for the New Burlington High School. So that was what, 350 million or something like that? Well, right now, their bond payments are gonna get figured in as part of their budget, and it's gonna get figured in as part of school spending. And we've generally tried to help with that, and we've been waiting on the school facilities thing. I don't know if it's been officially released, I thought it had. There was some shock in the other body, at least I think it was Representative Conlon looking at it.
Oh, the PCV stuff.
Oh, well, that's also new, and our solution has been, well, just slow down testing. Well, okay, but if it turns out in 10 years that my kid's been sitting in a poison school for 10 years, I'm gonna sue. Because we know there's an issue, and I think we have a full obligation to at least diagnose it and then to fix it. And, but that's all cost, and we're not dealing with it.
Right, well, we're also not so good on, we ask questions we don't want the answers to. How much, what's going on out there, how much will it cost? Then we start to see the cost, and we'd rather not know
Well,
that.
that's it, yeah, well, that's it, we don't wanna know, because then we're obligated to do something,
But I think you're right, it's a liability.
yeah, it
Once
does.
you know, and we do,
Once you know it's possible and you get so shocked by the first few finds that you say, well, we're not gonna do these tests anymore.
A rule for lawyers is never ask a question unless you do know the
The
answer.
answer, yeah.
so,
Or Randy's favorite, what didn't I ask you that I should have? Okay, I think we chewed on this bone as long as we can today.
we got all cleaned up. We're good.
Yeah. I think Senator Chittenden might be there. I think we need to do some short-term funding to get through this year. We both know what we're looking at, as those school budgets go down, that'll be about crossover. And we won't know until we go home
It's 5%.
what the budgets are.
We can't keep this for next year, because
Yeah.
No.
everybody will spend up again.
Well, that's
So
it.
where's the yield, and we're gonna be,
Yeah.
but we gotta get rid of it for next year.
And the schools that are doing the right thing are very worried about the yield because their costs are going up more than 5%, and you get to the 5th year. And you've got this huge put off bill.
Yeah.
And the yield is down so low that it's gonna be massive.
Rolling averages smooth things, so that's why I would just bring that back, if we get rid of this 5% for the next 4 years and go back to.
Well, yeah, that's what we've done before, when appraisals have. You get one town that would have a huge spike because they have one big sale of something, and we've done that rolling average.
Sure. These are all the reasons why Americans pay lower taxes than Europeans.
Why?
We don't spend it up.
Because our priority is paying lower taxes.
Yes. You mean you're gonna join me in that fight? No, I mean, Americans have very different, we want all the things that Europeans and Canadians have. But we're not paying 53%. My son never complains about paying 53 balls, eyeballs. But he's getting the services.
Where does he live?
Montreal.
Well, you know, this one, it's simplistic for me to say this, but it's not entirely. I don't know that many people who got a 12% pay bump this year, so they see that bill coming.
Who are the people that got the 12% pay bump this year?
Do you know the answer to that question? I don't.
I know who it isn't,
Yeah, it's not most people in Vermont,
and in Europe, people that have the 12% pay bumps
they pay them.
they get asked to kick in some money.
Well, we are going to have fair share here this week. I understand there's a wealth tax in the House if it makes it.
Texas just did a constitutional amendment not to have wealth taxes.
I don't know if we will, but I'm gonna have fair share in just because they have a proposal. If what we wanna do is, I've gotta hear a lot more about it for surcharge. The surcharge is supposed to be a short term. Pay for, I've used it for flood recovery, but, and we have flood recovery.
And, so and that's what we're talking about, a revolving loan fund. I don't know how the governor's proposed in the budget $1 million to get that started, but we're asking the ENR to come back with a list of high-risk dams that are in poor condition. It's like the most prioritized, and what's the bill for getting to
A
those?
lot more than $1 million.
Yes, that you're a winner already.
Yeah,
The answer's bigger than $1 million, you might even start really doing math.
and we've got the private dams like out in Maple Corners. It is fallen down. It's been there forever. And if it lets go, Maple Corners is under a foot or two of water. I mean, you lose all the value of Curtis Pond, which is a big recreation fishing site, so.
It's a private dam. Wow,
They hired a pump to pump water out in July and put it into that excess stream because they were afraid to get in like that. Okay,
well, we know that dam, you're liable for damages, though we're sorting out the language about that liability, but I mean, that's.
I don't care what anyone says, Wrightsville Dam is not in any danger.
Do you want to go on?